In late 2012, two sophomore students, Duncan Drummond and Paul Morse, embarked on a university project focused on programming. It eventually culminated in the action platformer Risk of Rain the following year. What's more, for the sequel, they transformed the first game's pixel art aesthetic into fully rendered 3D characters and environments, all achieved with a team that never exceeded 3 in-house developers. Risk of Rain's development journey began with sketches on scrap paper, as Duncan and Paul aimed to combine different genres to create a game that had all of their favorite gameplay mechanics in a single package. The duo have been close friends since 3rd grade and grew up playing lots of platformer games together. Once they decided to create their own platformer, they began infusing it with popular roguelike elements, including high replayability, permadeath, and a constantly randomized experience. In the game's initial prototype, players defended their crashed ship from an onslaught of monsters, and straying further from the ship would increase the difficulty. However, Duncan and Paul quickly realized that players lacked a strong incentive to leave the safety of their ship and explore further. That's when they came up with the time is difficulty mechanic that gave Risk of Rain its own identity. Simply explained, the longer you stay alive in each run, the more the difficulty ramps up. Players were now required to reach and activate a teleporter to progress to the next randomly generated level, all while upgrading their gear and surviving an endless swarm of increasingly formidable enemies as time went on. While fine-tuning the difficulty, the two students experimented with how monsters would scale in power relative to the player. Originally, the faster you dispatched enemies, the more powerful they would become. Essentially, as players collected more items and upgrades, becoming more efficient at eliminating enemies, those very same foes became tougher to defeat. However, after some time, Duncan and Paul noticed this didn't result in a rewarding gameplay experience. From a design point, it took out your highs and lows, and I think that's what's really interesting about the game, when you feel you've broken it, for a little bit at least, or if you feel absolutely overwhelmed. If we did the scaling with you correctly, I think it'd make every round feel the same. Consequently, they chose to lean more heavily on the time is difficulty system and make monsters grow stronger the longer you survive. This created a more impactful sense of urgency and forced players to make tough decisions often, something Duncan and Paul really wanted to emphasize. They made an exception for bosses though, as those always inflict damage proportional to a specific percentage of the player's health. According to Paul, this was implemented to ensure boss encounters always feel challenging and scary, regardless of the player's strength. Although it's clearly indicated that the difficulty increases every 5 minutes, there's a lot more happening behind the scenes than players might expect. The difficulty actually increases every single minute. To get a bit more technical, for each minute that passes, the game raises the power value of the monsters. This power value scales their health semi-exponentially and their damage output semi-logarithmically. These values are also influenced by the player's health and damage output, adjusting accordingly to prevent late-game scenarios where the player can deal excessive damage or be killed by enemies in a single hit. This system has the benefit of creating a more gradually challenging experience, while preserving the dynamic highs and lows during gameplay. Players might power up quickly by gaining XP and collecting upgrades, allowing them to wipe out enemies with ease. However, the enemies will eventually catch up, and could potentially overwhelm you sooner than you anticipate. Duncan and Paul admit that it's possible to break the game if you gather a specific set of items, like becoming invincible or being able to kill everything on screen without moving, but they consider this part of the fun in a single-player experience. Risk of Rain's pixel art style was chosen for two significant advantages. Not only did it enable the duo to rapidly create sprites, but it also gave them the artistic and technological freedom to design enormous boss sprites that could fill a big chunk of the screen, a key element Duncan and Paul wanted to include. Moreover, the undemanding art assets afforded them the chance to incorporate lots of dazzling special effects, aimed at keeping players visually engaged. Despite using pixel art, the duo did eventually encounter performance issues when testing the enemy spawn rate. See, enemies not only grow stronger the longer you keep a run going, but they also start to spawn more frequently. This process is controlled by an AI. Here's how it works. Each second, the AI is allocated a certain number of points. The number of points it receives every second increases as time goes on. Every 2 to 15 seconds, these points are automatically used by the AI to spawn monsters. For instance, a Lemurian costs 5 points, while a boss costs 800 points. Depending on its point balance, the AI may attempt to spawn as many Lemurians as possible. This led to an issue where GameMaker, the engine powering the game, began hitting its limitations and performance significantly dropped. Fortunately, Duncan and Paul quickly found a solution. When the spawn AI has enough points to place at least 5 monsters of the same type on the battlefield, it instead spawns one powered up version of that monster. This approach not only solved the problem, but also made combat more dynamic. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, Raycon. Raycon is disrupting the audio industry by making great wireless earbuds that start at half the price of other premium audio brands. Raycon's earbuds' seamless Bluetooth pairing, 8 hours of playtime, plus an additional 32 hours of battery provided by the charging case, combined with a compact design, makes them ideal for everyday use. They come in a range of fun colors and patterns, with a variety of fit options to make sure you always have a comfortable noise isolating experience. Use the tap functions to toggle between 3 customizable sound profiles, on top of a noise isolation mode and awareness mode. I use the noise isolation mode all the time when I'm commuting, and it makes my mornings that much more enjoyable. The awareness mode, on the other hand, is great to still hear the world around me during my summer walks. Furthermore, Raycon's 30-day free return policy gives you the opportunity to try them out before fully committing to your purchase. Click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/ThatGuyGlen to get 15% off your Raycon purchase today. Raycon, power up your everyday. Now back to the video. Growing up, Duncan and Paul mostly played PC games that largely ignored the use of a mouse, so it's no surprise that they adopted a similar approach when designing the keyboard layout for Risk of Rain. They aimed to provide a control scheme that was simple enough for anyone to pick up and play, whether you're a seasoned gamer or a newcomer. For those who prefer not to use keyboard controls, Duncan and Paul added controller support as well. Before each run, the player chooses a character class. Ensuring each class was unique yet maintained similar controls was a crucial part of development. The majority of the characters were designed around a specific weapon and a certain skill each character would most probably excel at. For instance, they envisioned Hand D as a giant robot capable of taking on large groups of enemies using only its fists. They realized this concept by providing Hand D with personal healer drones he could utilize to seek out monsters and steal their health while he continues to fight. Furthermore, it was important that each character possessed abilities that could showcase the player's skill. The Bandit, for example, can chain many different skills together by correctly timing headshots. While the game's title might not immediately make sense from just playing it, Duncan and Paul explained to Polygon they had good reasons for choosing it. Starting on, we wanted something that was easily Googleable so people could identify us. Eventually, we were set on the idea of idioms. After we looked through idioms meaning chance, we both mutually agreed that Risk of Rain was the coolest sounding one. We felt this name fit the game. There is a risk of rain, a risk of failure or bad things happening. As you can tell from all the unused sprites, lots of enemies, bosses, items and stages were either cut or reworked to better fit the final version of the game. One intriguing set of items that didn't make the cut includes the hero's cap, the hero's garb, and the hero's boots. These items are a nod to the Legend of Zelda games, specifically referencing Link's outfit. According to the developers, if a player had managed to gather all hero items, a special effect would have been activated. However, they never reached this point in development before deciding to remove these items. By April 2013, after about 5 months of development on a shoestring budget of just $100, the game was more or less complete, aside from some additional refinement and polish required. That being said, it was still missing a soundtrack at this stage. After reaching out to several composers via email, they decided to try their luck on YouTube. They typed in Best Music Composer Top 10 and stumbled upon a track by Chris Christodoulou. This piece, used in an indie game called Droidscape Basilica, was impressive enough to convince Duncan and Paul to email Chris. To their delight, he simply replied, "Hey, sounds good, let's do it." Naturally, Chris wouldn't be working for free. Besides needing a soundtrack, the team also wished to upgrade their version of GameMaker, which meant purchasing either GameMaker Studio or GameMaker 8.1. Therefore, to fully realize their vision for Risk of Rain, they would need to spend significantly more than the initial $100. As full-time college students, they didn't have much extra to spare. This prompted them to set up a Kickstarter campaign in April 2013 under the name Hopoo Games, with a funding goal of $7,000, enough to cover the cost of the soundtrack, GameMaker, and polishing the game. Just 4 days later, the project was fully funded, leaving ample time to reach additional stretch goals. In total, the Kickstarter campaign raised over $30,000, thanks to the generous support of 1,690 backers. It allowed the small team to add extra features such as more customization options and additional classes. The Kickstarter campaign itself attracted a great deal of attention, so much so that indie game developer and publisher Chucklefish offered to publish Risk of Rain. Duncan and Paul accepted their proposal. Chucklefish not only provided them with a website, complete with a forum, but also connected a team with Matthew Griffin, a developer who had previously collaborated with Chucklefish. Matthew lent his expertise to help Hopoo Games establish and support online co-op. Although the game already supported local co-op at this stage, Paul and Duncan assured players that the addition of multiplayer would not compromise their commitment to creating the best possible single-player experience. While the two developers were busy making sure the game works, Chris was given free rein to craft the soundtrack as he saw fit. Paul and Duncan fully trusted Chris's expertise and ability to compose great music. Once Chris had compiled a collection of songs, he simply sent them over to Duncan and Paul, who then determined where each track would fit best within the game. In November 2013, less than a year after development started, Risk of Rain was released on PC. Garnering positive reviews, a devoted fanbase rapidly formed post-release, keeping the co-op servers busy. The game even became an award-winning success, with Duncan and Paul being honored with the Best Student Game Award at the 2014 Independent Games Festival. Development on Risk of Rain 2 began around late 2016. Earlier that year, Hopoo Games had developed and released a stealth action hybrid game called Deadbolt. Yet, Risk of Rain continued to gain popularity 3 years post-release, partially due to its debut on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita in April 2016. By this time, Duncan and Paul had graduated from college and were dedicating themselves full-time to game development. They also welcomed Jeffrey Hunt to the team, who assumed the role of the main programmer for the sequel's development. Although Risk of Rain 2 would eventually transform into a three-dimensional third-person shooter, it didn't initially start off this way. The team's primary objective was to do something different with the sequel, something more innovative. The original twist was that players would control the monsters this time around. Additionally, Duncan was particularly enthusiastic about incorporating the ability to display items on characters, an idea inspired by fan art they frequently encountered online. The initial prototype started off with 2D pixel art. However, according to Duncan, visually representing items on characters proved challenging. As a solution, they transitioned to 2.5D graphics. In order to achieve quality results in this art style, Duncan and Paul began crafting 3D models for the items and characters and displayed them in a 2.5D perspective. When they completed a new prototype, they thought to themselves, "We're almost in 3D at this point, should we just give it a shot?" The transition from 2D to 3D took place over a span of less than a month. Once they had familiarized themselves with a 3D workflow and felt confident about their capabilities, things escalated quickly. That's when the real work started. In an interview with PC Gamer, Paul mentioned that the game dev experience they had gained from Risk of Rain and Deadbolt didn't exactly translate to their first 3D project. Consequently, they had to relearn a lot before development could properly begin. For example, Duncan, who had only utilized Paint for creating sprites in the prior game, had never done any 3D modeling before Risk of Rain 2. It was a significant leap for him to learn all the rules and technical nuances of 3D modeling, and getting accustomed to the sequel's engine, Unity. Even as they became more familiar with this new way of working, numerous tasks proved to be far more time-consuming compared to their 2D game development experience. The cost of time per asset has gone up a lot. With our previous projects, we did a lot of our design via iteration. We would do a very rapid prototype and then refine it. But in 3D, it doesn't work that way. A lot of times, if you want to change step 2, you ruin every step afterward. You have to start over from scratch. You can't refine and iterate in the same way. During the early stages of development, the team had one primary focus. Would it still be fun to play in 3D if they use the same characters, items, difficulty system and gameplay objectives from the original game? As a result, the first prototype incorporated the Commando player character along with two familiar monsters, the Lemurian and the Golem. However, they soon realized that they couldn't directly adapt any of the original gameplay elements into the sequel. Every class and monster taken from the original had to undergo substantial revisions. For instance, melee monsters were considerably easier to overcome since players now had an extra dimension for strategizing their approach. As a response, the Golem, which was previously a purely melee-based monster, is now equipped with a laser so it can also attack from a distance. Similarly, the Lemurian was given the ability to shoot fireballs. According to Duncan, the shift to a 3D environment also significantly impacted the game mechanics. Being able to see far into the distance, as opposed to only seeing what's within the screen, drastically altered the effectiveness of certain abilities. In the original 2D game, players were restricted to shooting enemies that were right in front of them, but the transition to 3D now allowed targeting of different monsters. Furthermore, some abilities became more challenging and engaging to use effectively, such as the Commando's FMJ, which fires in a straight line. In 2D, it was far easier to hit multiple enemies with this ability, but in 3D, players need to align themselves along a line of monsters to use this ability effectively. This change introduces a greater level of challenge, but also yields a more satisfying experience when executed properly. This early prototype confirmed that Duncan and Paul were on the right track and strengthened their confidence. That said, the duo admitted they were very nervous about announcing Risk of Rain 2. They recognized the need to skillfully blend familiar content with new elements, given the dramatic shift in visuals and gameplay. Despite this, they were uncertain about how well players would accept these significant changes. About 6 months into development, in May 2017, Hopoo Games officially announced Risk of Rain 2 on their development blog. It's important to note that by this point, Hopoo Games had parted ways with publisher Chucklefish, meaning marketing and other business-related tasks fell back on Paul and Duncan. This is partially why Risk of Rain 2 was announced so early in development. Without the luxury of a dedicated person or team to maintain the hype, they felt compelled to advertise as soon as possible, alerting their fans that a new game was on its way. By December 2017, the studio had completed its first map. At this point, the developers were considering whether to incorporate procedural generation. Given that the stages were going to be larger than those in the original game, they weren't sure if permutations would be necessary. The team experimented with this for a while, but the challenge of creating memorable procedurally generated maps in 3D proved too demanding for a team of their size. Instead, they focused on providing as much variation as possible by giving each stage multiple regions with plenty of secrets to discover. When it came to the story and lore, the developers sought to replicate the approach of the first game and expand upon it. Duncan and Paul favor creating games without interruptive cutscenes during gameplay, which is why both Risk of Rain games convey their narratives through various logbook entries. Although gameplay always comes first, the logbook entries provide the option for players to immerse themselves in the game's world and lore. Even though online co-op was more of an afterthought in the original Risk of Rain, ensuring an easily accessible online multiplayer experience took center stage during the sequel's development. This priority was established even before Duncan and Paul considered switching to 3D. The feedback from the first game made it clear to them that there was a significant demand for a more streamlined multiplayer experience, more so than they had initially expected. With much more experience under their belt this time, they managed to make connecting with players online as easy as pressing a single button. Creating exciting item variety has always been a core principle for the team, and the design of each item starts with a specific purpose in mind, while also considering player choice whenever possible. Take the Monster Tooth for instance. While it might not be the most thrilling item in the game, it serves a crucial role of keeping players in the fight by rewarding them with a healing opportunity after every kill. The team at Hopoo Games could have simply programmed this item to gain X amount of health for every monster defeated. Instead, they designed it so that as players eliminate more monsters, more health orbs begin to spawn around the map. This gives players the choice of when to heal themselves, if at all. As mentioned earlier, a primary motivation for the studio's transition to 3D was to display collected items on the player character. This decision was made not only for aesthetic appeal, but also to address the lack of tangible progression in the first game. By ensuring that players could visually perceive how their items and equipment were transforming their character during gameplay, they hoped to enhance the sense of progression. The transition to a fully 3D environment required that most items from the original Risk of Rain be redesigned. However, this shift also unlocked a vast array of possibilities for item effects and their uses. For example, one of the team's favorite new items, the Royal Capacitor, which targets a specific enemy for a massive lightning strike, was only made possible due to the switch to 3D. When introducing new characters and items into the game, the team often considered their impact on both single player and multiplayer, as both were equally significant this time around. For this reason, they implemented a system that scales the difficulty level based on the number of online players to ensure a challenging experience for everyone. Hopoo Games knew the development of the 3D sequel would take significantly longer than the original, but they didn't want to deprive fans of a new Risk of Rain experience for much longer. Therefore, in late 2018, the team started assembling a plan to launch Risk of Rain 2 in early access. After extensively studying other successful early access games, they zeroed in on 3 key goals. First, they aimed to cultivate a robust community of players with whom they could actively communicate during and after the game's early access period. Second, they strived to maintain a steady pace of development, avoiding any content drought by releasing regular patches and substantial content updates. Lastly, they wanted to gather as much feedback and ideas as possible, ensuring Risk of Rain 2 would align with players' expectations. The early access version launched in March 2019. In an effort to entice players to experience a significantly improved multiplayer, the studio initiated a buy one get one free promotion for the first few days. Selling 1 million copies within a single month, this proved to be a savvy decision. Community feedback played a pivotal role in balancing items, characters, enemies, and stages. Item balancing in particular was a frequent topic of discussion among the developers. With so many item variations and tiers, there was always something that needed tweaking. Moreover, the team strived to prioritize player skill over luck, to prevent the game from feeling as though success relied solely on finding good items. One of the more major ways we are trying to stray players away from those feelings is with the character system. Even if the player doesn't get a specific item or equipment at the start of the game, they can extend their run by playing smart and actively influencing certain outcomes in the game to help them bridge that gap. Once again, Chris collaborated with Hopoo Games to create the soundtrack. He wanted to make it feel like a continuation of the previous soundtrack without being repetitive. The tracks are heavily influenced by progressive rock and electronic music from the 70s, drawing inspiration from King Crimson, Pink Floyd, Vangelis, and Jean-Michel Jarre. Naturally, he incorporated his own influences, sensibilities, and unique style. Chris describes the soundtrack as standing firmly on the foundation laid by the original Risk of Rain soundtrack, with many motifs, themes, and even entire sections carrying over. The soundtrack was composed parallel to the game's development. Duncan and Paul let Chris play a portion of the game very early in development, enough to understand how it works and how it's both similar and different from the original. The time is difficulty system is directly reflected in the compositions, which almost to no exception start more relaxed and build up to huge climactic crescendos. Moreover, the use of multiple voices, intricate counterpoints and so on, known as the Baroque style, mirrors the busy gameplay. The shift to early access directly impacted Chris's workflow. For instance, they needed a sufficient number of tracks for the early access launch, which meant using unfinished music. This was a difficult decision for Chris, as he was aware that players would become attached to tracks that would undergo substantial changes in the future, possibly causing people to get upset, which is exactly what happened. Despite player feedback, Chris is extremely proud of the outcome, considering the compositions in Risk of Rain 2 to be better mixed, a result of careful consideration and hard work. Similar to how Chucklefish reached out during the first game's Kickstarter phase, Gearbox Publishing partnered with Hopoo Games during the sequel's early access period to facilitate ports for the PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. On August 11th, 2020, nearly 4 years after development began, Risk of Rain 2 left early access and Hopoo released version 1.0 for PC. The response from critics and gamers was even more positive compared to the original. Reviewers described the game as immensely satisfying to play, with few flaws or shortcomings. Some even hailed it as one of the greatest roguelikes of all time. As a result, Risk of Rain 2 saw concurrent player peaks of over 70,000 on Steam, surpassing games such as The Binding of Isaac, Loop Hero, Darkest Dungeon, Hades, and Dead Cells. What's more, as of March 2021, over 4 million copies have been sold on PC alone. An expansion pack called Survivors of the Void was released in 2021 for PC, adding new player characters, enemies, bosses, items, and stages. However, in November 2022, the announcement that the rights to the Risk of Rain IP had been sold to Gearbox caused concern among many fans about the future of Risk of Rain 2 and potential sequels. Duncan and Paul explained that while they loved working on Risk of Rain, they were continually exploring new creative opportunities, which may not necessarily fit within the same genre as Risk of Rain. However, they expressed their desire to continue supporting the community and providing exciting new content. After 3 years of collaborating with Gearbox, it seemed a logical decision to hand over the reins and entrust them with carrying forward the IP. Shortly after selling the rights, a remake of the original game, titled Risk of Rain Returns, was announced, and this project is a collaborative effort between Hopoo Games and Gearbox. Initially, Duncan and Paul were quite hesitant about updating the original game. However, they believe that as long as the remake stays true to the original design and improves several player pain points, they could create something truly special for existing fans. Additionally, this would give players new to Risk of Rain a chance to look back where it all started. Importantly, the Risk of Rain modding community is directly involved with the remake, ensuring that everything remains faithful to the original. Hopoo Games remains independent as of this video's release, and in an interview with Game Rant in May 2023, the developers assured fans that they're keeping a watchful eye over their beloved IP. I think we'll always be interested in how it's going with Risk of Rain, and if there's ever a need for help or if we want to see what's going on, I think it's always going to be collaborative between us and Gearbox. But mostly, we just want to make sure that the IP is in good hands and all the products are great. Our biggest focus right now is making sure all the stuff that comes out is still quality, that people are happy, and that it's fitting the vision. After that, Duncan and I can make something new.